One of the upcoming movies I have been the most excited about is Red Sonja, starring Matilda Lutz from director MJ Basset. We have documented the making of that movie for years now, more extensively than anyone else on the internet, I believe, and ever since Bassett came aboard to direct, I have been optimistic and that movie's biggest defender. But I was always clear that if my optimism were to be shaken, I would let you all know. And here we are. Let's dive in. Have you all seen the miniseries Chernobyl? If you haven't, you really need to, because it's one of the best miniseries ever made. But I am going somewhere with this, so even if you haven't seen it, what you need to know is that in the early days, no one really knew how bad that whole ordeal was shaping up to be. It was initially dismissed as just a fire, put it out and be done with it. But someone noticed graphite on the ground, and considering that graphite only appears inside the reactor core, it obviously wasn't supposed to be on the ground. No one knew the exact machinations of how graphite had ended up on the ground, yet there it was. And whatever had happened for graphite from the reactor core to end up on the ground, it couldn't possibly have been any good. That's where we are with Red Sonja right now. We don't know what has happened behind the scenes, and I'm sure the powers that be would like us to think that nothing has happened at all, yet there is graphite on the ground, where it's not supposed to be. There it is though, so something must have happened, and it can't have been good. Now obviously, there is no literal graphite on the ground, as Red Sonja is a movie production, and not the Soviet-era RBMK nuclear reactor. But we have some cryptic public statements that serve the exact same purpose. Because that these statements exist strongly suggests that something has transpired behind the scenes, and while we don't know what, we can surmise it's nothing good. So let's have a look at the graphite in question, which comes from MJ Bassett's Instagram account. There, an MAA session was held, where Bassett was asked questions pertaining to Red Sonja, and kudos to Red Label who screen-grabbed the pertinent answers and reported them on X, and to Crease1984 who put this on my radar, because this suggests trouble behind the scenes. Bassett was asked, "Have you got final cut of Red Sonja?" To which the answer was, "Nope." There are a couple of ways to interpret that, of course, but considering both the callousness of how that answer was framed and that the movie was done filming in late 2022, more than a year and a half ago, none of them are good. Now, the most obvious interpretation of the question is, do you, as the director, or the studio as the bill payer, determine the final cut of the movie? And the answer to that is that it's almost always the studio. Unless you're James Cameron, the director is but a hired gun doing the studio's bidding, and so the studio politically correct answer to that question would have been to make it clear that while you as a filmmaker and the studio are on the same page and have a great working relationship, the studio always has final edit, because that's just how these things are, and no one would have taken any issue with such an answer or read anything bad into it. But when Bassett then proceeds to respond to that question with "Nope," that sounds a tad bitter, as if there was some disagreement over that final cut, and the director might not be too pleased with the studio's decisions. But then again, for all we know, Bassett could have answered on the fly without thinking it through. But still, reading that one-word answer, I interpret that as soft distancing. I do believe that is how this question and answer should be read and interpreted, but I said more interpretations were possible, so let's humor that for a moment. Suppose Bassett read this on the fly and misread the question as, "Do you have a final cut of the movie?" and thus intended to answer, "Nope, we are still working on tweaking that final cut." If that were to be the accurate read, it would still be bad, because filming concluded a year and a half ago. As a general thing, the final cut is locked before the movie is scored, and the scoring sessions have reportedly already taken place. So if they suddenly don't have a final cut now, they must have had second thoughts and gone back to change things, which also spells trouble. Either way, in isolation, This mix of question and answer doesn't conclusively mean that things must be bad behind the scenes, though there certainly are more negative ways to interpret that than positive. What makes this even worse, though, is that there is another question and answer combo still to go through. Bassett was also asked, got more job offers with New Image Millennium, which is the name of the production company, to which Bassett answered, "I don't anticipate being offered any movies by the studio again." Note that this is not an impolite answer. No protocol is being breached here, and no one is being thrown under any bus. And yet, that answer does suggest that Bassett and the studio must have had some kind of falling out. And read in conjunction with the previous answer, I'm inclined to believe the final cut and ultimate direction of the movie just might have something to do with that. In fact, interference from the producers at Millennium was my main concern since the moment this iteration of Red Sonja was announced. Here's what I said in our video from August 27th of 2022. But that brings us to the other thing that has me apprehensive: Millennium and its cadre of producers, led by Avi Lerner. There have been many previous attempts at Red Sonja movies, and for one reason or the other, they all fell apart. Something else which fell apart, even though it got made and was released, was the disastrous 2011 Conan the Barbarian reboot. The constant through all of this is producer Avi Lerner and the cadre around him at Millennium Pictures, who will also be producing this. Every single past failure, whether to launch or to land, happened on their watch. The reasons differed each and every time, but there was always something, and that suggests something systemic and in Millennium's end. To me, the big question is, will they step back and let Bassett handle this, or will they infuse their particular brand of movie-making magic? Back to current times, we can add another entry into Millennium's list of greatest hits, namely the 2019 Hellboy reboot. While it is a guilty pleasure of mine, director Neil Marshall has since come out and distanced himself from it, calling it the worst professional experience of his life, putting all the blame for that on the producers at Millennium for their extreme interference and for changing their minds about what kind of movie they wanted between filming and editing. Also worth paying attention to here for future reference is Wright's retainer Hellboy The Crooked Man. All of that said, I can see an objection the producers at Millennium might have, which wouldn't be entirely without merit. Let's enter the speculation zone. For nigh on a decade now, Hollywood has been all about girl bosses, vilifying and emasculating male characters, and featuring propagandistic storytelling that subverts gender roles and societal dynamics. See no further than Star Wars The Acolyte for a contemporary example. At one point in its development, this is the direction Red Sonja was headed as well, before Bassett came in and rewrote most of the madness out. See this video, which is linked to in the description, for more details on that. And yet, the core story, as well as the overall take on the movie, still hails from an era in filmmaking that the movie-going audience has since completely and utterly rejected. The Marvels is the biggest flop in MCU history. Sony's Madam Web outflopped even Morbius. Furiosa flopped so badly it killed 2 planned proper Mad Max sequels. And The Acolyte is tanking on Disney Plus right now as we speak. And the problem for Red Sonja is that by the time any of that audience pushback happened, it was already filmed and in the can, a product of the era that the audience now has rejected. I can see Millennium being nervous about however much Bassett shifted the movie away from Hollywood's wokeness when it was filmed in 2022. It may not have been enough for the movie-going audience of 2024 and 2025, when it's likely to come out. I would certainly hope they're nervous about that, because I am, and it's their movie, so they should be. To illustrate what I mean, in its wokest iteration, Hannah John Kamen, a black actress, was cast as the red-headed Red Sonja, and she would have been covered up throughout the movie because of the deeply problematic male gaze. Oh, and lest we forget, the movie was going to be so LGBTQIAP+ coded like you have no idea. I'm not saying Sweet Baby Inc. worked on it, but it went so woke that they might as well have. Luckily, that ended with Bassett, who cast Matilda Lutz instead, who not only will be a redhead for the movie, but who will show some skin and sport the iconic chainmail bikini in it. All massive steps in the right direction for the time. However, Matilda Lutz looks more like an MMA fighter than the more voluptuous Red Sonja of the comics. And just a few months ago, she too spoke out against the male gaze and how the movie is all about female empowerment. All standard Hollywood talking points to be clear, but since the audience had moved on by the time these comments were dropped, they translated to a hype-killing certified PR disaster from which the movie may never recover. While Red Sonja has always had a significant female following, it is a male-driven brand with a predominantly male audience at the core. Trying to force the movie into an ideologically driven female-centric mold that Hollywood approves of can do nothing but drive the audience, male and female alike, away. While Bassett probably made the best Red Sonja movie that could have come out of Hollywood when it was filmed in 2022, the problem is that the audience have since rejected Hollywood's entire Puritan and restrictive mold for movies like this wholesale. I think the only Red Sonja movie that audiences would not only embrace today, but actively flock towards, is one that fully embraces what it is and stars someone fully on board with that. Like Sydney Sweeney. Such a Red Sonja movie, I think, could have been one of the biggest hits of the year, with men and women alike, while the movie that they actually did make, insofar as we know, still doesn't even have distribution. That's right, even with the shortage of movies after the lockdown and 2 consecutive strikes, this movie still hasn't found a buyer. That suggests to me that whatever the problem may be, we don't know exactly what. I'm just speculating here. There is nonetheless something wrong with the movie, which one way or the other led to a strained relationship between the studio and Bassett, and thus the comments we got. My guess is that a big part of the problem, though, is that the movie might already be a relic from a time when Hollywood was trapped in a mindset that the audience is so over. And now, Millennium are scrambling to fix something that can't be fixed, not without pulling a David Zaslav and starting over. But that is just my guess. More news of what actually has happened to follow as we learn them. For now, let me know your thoughts on this in the comments.